Hi, hey guys. Good to see you. How are you doing, Senator? Good to see you too.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for all of your work on it.
Senator, you all appreciate it as well.
Yeah, I'm going to have a seat.
Sure. Hit it.
Oh, that's Congressman Brent. We're going to start in just a second as Congressman Khanna comes up here.
Hey, bro. Great to see
Hi, Rob.
Either way. Oh, we'll kick it off. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. In a moment, I'm going to hand the program over to the members and the senators who are here. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Stephen Miles. I'm the Executive Director of Win Without War. Behind me, you have, in addition to the members of Congress, a number of representatives from organizations who have worked together to help pass legislation to prevent a war with Iran. This legislation was bipartisan legislation. It had bipartisan majorities in both chambers of Congress. And we're going to hear today from a number of voices about why this legislation needs to be in the final version of the National Defense Authorization Act. And to kick us off, I would just say that for too long in Washington, it's been a bipartisan position to start wars. And today we're deeply excited that there's emerging bipartisan consensus to stop wars before they ever begin. So to begin today, I'm going to hand the program over to Congressman Khanna from California, who's going to kick us off.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Win Without War and to J Street for organizing this and for your leadership. I'm going to be brief because we have so many distinguished colleagues. We had a huge win in the House, 251 to 170. The amendment passed to prevent this president from going on an offensive war against Iran. It would defund the president from taking any action in Iran that was offensive. We just had a meeting, a constructive meeting with Senator Schumer. He's convinced, as is the Senate, that we are going to fight for this to make sure it's in the Senate. And I am very hopeful that this marks a turning point and prevents another war in the Middle East. I want to now call Senator Sanders, who has been a leader on Yemen and stopping the war in Yemen, and of course passed the first war powers resolution in the history of this country, and has also been a consistent leader on Iran. Senator Sanders.
Okay, let me thank Ro for all the great work, and everybody else is here. And I know, given this beautiful, cool day, you want a 3-hour speech, but you're not going to get it. Sorry. Look, the bottom line is that a war with Iran would be an unmitigated disaster. The war in Iraq was the worst foreign policy blunder in the modern history of this country, cost us thousands of young men and women, trillions of dollars in terms of endless wars. And what we are saying today is that the Constitution of the United States is very clear. Guess what? It is the United States Congress that has the constitutional authority to determine whether this country goes to war or not the President of the United States. And I want to congratulate everybody here, people in the House, people in the Senate, for beginning to reassert our constitutional responsibility. So what we are saying, what will the Trump administration do? You know what? Nobody in the world, including the Trump administration, knows what they're going to do tomorrow. Do they want to go to war? Who knows? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But given the confusion in that administration, what we do know is that there is a possibility that they may end up taking us into a disastrous war. So what we are saying today as clearly as we can, and I want to thank the members of the House for putting this language into the Defense Authorization Bill, is no war unless you come to the Congress and you get permission for that war. That's a big deal. The House did it. I will do everything that I can to make sure that that language stays in that legislation in the Senate. So congratulations to everybody for demanding that the President respects the Constitution. No war without congressional authorization. Thank you.
I think we'll just call on folks as they braved the heat in the order that they came. I know Senator Udall had the amendment in the Senate, and so thank you for your leadership. If you want to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I say first of all, bravo to the House, to Representative Khanna, all of the sponsors that are here, Chairman Smith, for putting this in the defense authorization bill. This is a very, very important amendment. You know, the American people don't support war with Iran. They don't support another endless conflict in the Middle East. And they certainly don't support an unconstitutional war. Now Congress is showing we won't roll over for an unauthorized war either. In the Senate, we held a historic vote on my amendment with Senator Kaine, Murphy, who will be here later, and Merkley were also helping and fighting hard on this, along with a number of other senators. Our amendment was to prevent war with Iran unless authorized by Congress. A bipartisan majority of the Senate supported the amendment. That amendment said no to the kind of unconstitutional war that this president and his advisors keep marching us toward. I'm proud that the House has now taken up the mantle, voting on a bipartisan basis to pass the Khanna amendment. Soon we're headed to conference. Both houses have spoken, and a bipartisan majority in both support this amendment. The will of the Congress and the American people is to prevent an unauthorized war with Iran. The final NDAA bill must reflect that fact. It must include language to prevent unconstitutional war. Failing to do so would ignore the voice of the people and the Constitution, which squarely places the authority to declare war with the Congress, no other, with the Congress. Thank you very much, and great to be with you here today. Thank you.
I now want to recognize my good friend, Representative Anna Eshoo. She had this bill, the identical bill that we put as an amendment to the NDAA. She has been working on that bill for months in the House to get us to the point to have this majority. So thank you for your leadership, Anna Eshoo.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking the fabulous advocates, to J Street, to Win Without War, to NIAC, to Vote Vets, and all the groups that have really been the wind beneath our sails. I also want to pay tribute to Khanna, my next-door neighbor, not next-door neighbor here, but our congressional districts are adjoining, and to the House members that were part of putting together the amendment that was voted on. As we stand here in the heat of a Washington July, I think it's appropriate to say that the Trump administration is playing with fire when it comes to Iran. And I think what the House did with this extraordinary vote of 251 bipartisan members of the House voting on this, we pulled out a fire extinguisher on this. And this needs to continue in the Senate because, as was said before, the American people do not want to go to war. Now, what we have is not only the president, but his hawkish advisors that say we can essentially do whatever we want and we don't have to go to the Congress. Well, you know what? They're not only wrong, they're dead wrong. To initiate hostilities, it is up to the Congress of the United States to make that decision. And so the prohibition of using any funds to go to war in Iran is really essential. And they're wrong because we have a constitution. I don't know if the president has read it, but it is in the Constitution that is the Congress that makes that decision. We, the representatives of the people, the voice of the people, are the ones to make that decision. So I think in not only these hot days, but these rather dark days, with the drumbeat of the administration, that the Congress, the United States House of Representatives, has really stood tall. And I think that it's because of the work of these members. Thank you, Ro, for your kind words about my legislation. That came about working with J Street when they came to meet with me last March and then introduced the legislation that created co-sponsorships, then was linked to this effort. So thank you to all of us. We're not going to be satisfied until the Senate follows the great lead of the House and sends the most powerful message to the President of the United States that the Constitution will be honored and that the responsibility of the Congress, this rests with the Congress and not the President or his hawk advisors. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Representative Eshoo. We've been joined with Senator Murphy, who's been one of the great champions for our party on foreign policy restraint, and who has the humility to say he's going to have the three members of Congress and the House speak first. So, Representative Lee, I was bragging about her this morning to a reporter who's doing a profile, a justified profile on her, as being a profile of courage in speaking out in 2001 against the blank check and authorization of force. She's been such a moral conscience for our Congress. Representative Lee.
Thank you very much, Congressman Khanna, and I just have to thank you and salute you for your tremendous leadership. This is really historic, what you have done, what all of you have done, what we have done together. And I just want to also thank all of our groups for really doing the hard work that it takes to get us to this point. It's so important right now that Congress reasserts its constitutional responsibility in matters of war and peace. The Trump administration's, first of all, his decision to unilaterally withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, a deal he knew was working, really crystallized this for us. The drumbeats of war were very, very loud. The adoption of this bipartisan amendment makes sure that the president hears from us very clearly that he cannot circumvent Congress to start a war with Iran. We must make it very clear that this prohibition must stand and hold in the Senate version of the bill, and I want to thank our senators for that. I'm confident that we're going to be able to move this bill forward to the president's desk. I also want to just say again to Congressman Khanna and to all of our colleagues here, I want to thank them for also making sure that we put into the Defense Appropriations Bill an amendment that repealed the 2001 authorization. That was so important because they were using that also as the foundation and the framework to talk about the use of force against Iran. And also, we repealed the 2002 authorization to use force with Iraq. And so the message is loud and clear. And it is just remarkable that we got to this historic point this year. I think everything came together. The country understands the dangers of the use of force and going to war with Iran. And so, again, Ro, thank you very much for your leadership. Thank you for bringing us all together to make sure that this authorization, this message about coming to Congress for us to do our job, we shouldn't have to send that message. This is our constitutional responsibility. But we have to do it anyway, so we did it. And so I think that the American people will continue to fight to make sure that this becomes the law. And thank you again very much.
Thank you, Representative Lee. The next person I want to call up, Representative Schakowsky, has, along with Representative Lee, Representative Eshoo, Speaker Pelosi, been a voice against the original Iraq War. And since then, these tremendous advocates have been fighting for a greater restraint in our foreign policy and human rights. Representative Schakowsky, if you could share a few words.
Thank you. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution of the United States makes it absolutely clear. It is the role of Congress to declare war, and we are making it clear now in this legislation that has passed the House of Representatives. We're very proud of that. I want to thank all the people that have been involved in making that happen. You know, we can say, well, the president has said he doesn't really want to go to war, and yet everything that he's been doing indicates that he is moving in that direction. The first act to undo what was one of the greatest diplomatic achievements that we have seen in recent history, the Iran deal, to prevent that country from having nuclear weapons. Many of the people who stand here today worked so hard to make sure that the votes were there to do that. Then we see the reinstatement of sanctions. We see very sketchy kinds of actions being blamed on Iran in the waters around Iran. That we know, look, Iran is a bad actor, which would be a much worse actor if they had nuclear weapons. So the Congress has come together in a bipartisan way to say, no, we are going to exert our rights. We are going to say that only Congress, that the President of the United States has to stop playing games, come to us to get authorization, and we will not give it because the American people are sick of war. They're sick of another war in the Middle East, and it cannot happen without authorization that we are going to be fighting against. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Schakowsky. Before I call on Representative Levin, I want to acknowledge our chairman of the Rules Committee, Jim McGovern, just got here, and he really fought to get us a vote on this amendment. We wouldn't have had it come to the floor without him. Representative Levin had an extraordinary bill from the beginning of this Congress that made it clear that the 2001 and 2002 AUMF do not apply to Iran, and he has done a phenomenal job building a lot of the coalition and support that led to this passage. Representative Levin?
Thank you so much, Ro. I want to salute the groups Win Without War, J Street. I want to add one in particular because they're so active holding me accountable, Ro, in Michigan's 9th District, Peace Action. So to Reverend Rich Peacock and all my other folks back home, thank you for keeping up the pressure on the Congress not to take us to war. You know, Jan, I want to add the words about the war powers from Article 2. I'm not the commander-in-chief language. People don't focus on the full language. Article 2, Section 2 says that the President shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called in to the actual service of the United States. Who calls them in? We do. Article 1 says it's the Congress of the United States that decides when we go to war. Even Article 2 makes that clear when they call the President the Commander-in-Chief. It really was, I'm the new kid here, and it really was one of my very proudest moments of my young congressional career here when I introduced the AUMF Clarification Act. And to have 70 co-sponsors, bipartisan, and the support of my leadership on the Foreign Affairs Committee and so many members to just simply say to the President, neither AUMF 1 nor AUMF 2 nor any other thing that the Congress has passed gives you the authority to go to war with Iran. If you want that, come back and see us, and we'll see about that. I've been alarmed by this since Secretary Pompeo, in answer to a question in a Senate hearing, started talking about the intimate links between Al-Qaeda and the Iranian regime. Have we ever heard that before? Phony assertions of links between 9/11 and another regime. That was one of the two big lies that led to the war with Iraq. So the House of Representatives is standing up strong, saying no unauthorized war with Iraq. Under Roe's leadership and Chairman Smith's, we've gotten this into the NDAA, and we're counting on our friends in the Senate to stand with us to get this done in the final spending bill for the military. Thank you very much for all your leadership out here.
Thank you, Representative Levin. I now want to introduce one of my favorite senators, Senator Chris Murphy, who really, not only has he been leading on Yemen and Iran, but is undergoing a huge project to articulate a progressive foreign policy that I think is long overdue. And Senator Murphy has really been leading that effort. Senator Murphy? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ro. It's fantastic to be here with so many peace activists. Thank you to all the organizations for making this moment possible, for guiding the House measure to passage. I'm glad that we had a good turnout here from the Senate to make it clear that you have friends in the Senate that are going to demand that this legislation and this language eventually, somehow, some way, pass the United States Senate and get to the president's desk. Let me just add two quick thoughts. First, if others haven't mentioned it before, remember that there is just a perpetual war motion machine in this town, right? There is an industry built on intervention in Washington, D.C. There are smart people at these think tanks, but they exist to make the argument that the United States can solve, often with military force, every problem in the world. And that doesn't mean that we don't listen to experts. It just means that we remember that there are a lot of people who make a lot of money in this town and across this country when we put our men and women in harm's way. And so it is important that at these moments when you could have a series of mistakes, of mistaken interpretations lead to the outbreak of war, that we set a firm line in the sand. Second, in about an hour, Senator Romney and I are going to have a hearing on the future of American policy in Iraq. And it is important to remember that while the most dangerous outcome of these mindless escalations with the Iranians that the administration is involved in is war, there are also lots of other deleterious effects to American national security that happen along the way. When we called the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a terrorist group, that meant that we could no longer work with Iraqi militias who had any relationship with Iran inside Iraq. It made political reconciliation inside Iraq much harder. It made our diplomats and our soldiers' job that much harder. And it made ISIS's job even easier inside that country. And so when you have this kind of escalation with no end game, first and foremost, the danger is war. But that kind of nonsensical policy has all sorts of bad outcomes along the way. And that's why I'm glad to be here to join in support of this resolution, to celebrate its passage in the House, and to commit myself along with my colleagues to bringing it across the finish line in the Senate. Thank you, Representative Khanna.
I now want to introduce Representative Jim McGovern. Representative McGovern has been an advocate for human rights his entire congressional career, an advocate on matters of war and peace. I will just say this, you want to be on the right side of this with the Speaker of the House, you want to be on the right side of Representative McGovern, because he gets to decide what comes to the floor, and it's been a privilege having been in two Congresses. Last Congress, nothing that limited war or asserted Congress came to the floor, and now we have a chairman who's bringing as much to the floor to reassert Congress's authority on matters of war and peace.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Ro Khanna for his leadership, and I'm proud to be his colleague, and all my other colleagues who are here today. And I want to thank the organizations and the groups that are standing behind me here today for the grassroots advocacy and supporting a more rational, sane foreign policy, one that keeps us out of these crazy wars. You know, I think the American people are fed up with endless wars, and I think they're frustrated and sick and tired of politicians, but in particular presidents like the one we have in office, who talk so freely and so nonchalantly about going to war, to be able to exert their so-called toughness. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't take any courage for President Trump to threaten war, even to go to war, because his kids aren't going to be fighting in those wars. You know, nobody in his family will be affected directly by these wars, but yet countless others across this country, they will be. You know, having lived through Afghanistan and Iraq, and having gone to so many funerals where parents have hugged me and asked me why. Why did my son, why did my daughter lose their life for this? What was the cause? We don't even know why we're in Afghanistan anymore, and yet we're still there. And when this president starts rattling the sabers and talking about going to war in Iran, I mean, maybe he thinks war will distract the American people from his ineffective and failed record as president, or maybe he thinks it will distract from his hate and his racism, or maybe he's so incompetent that he doesn't know what he's thinking, which might be the case. But the bottom line is, we almost went to war with Iran, I'm glad we didn't, but it's little comfort that it was stopped 10 minutes before we were about to launch an attack. Bottom line is Congress, the people who work here, need to do their job. And that is that if the president wants to go to war, he has to come to Congress, we have to debate it, and we have to vote on it. It's that simple. No war without coming to Congress. And again, thanks to the leadership of the people and the groups that are assembled up here, we passed by a very impressive margin an amendment that says just that. The great British conservative Edmund Burke said a conscientious man would be cautious in how he dealt in blood. We ought to pay attention to those words. I get really nervous that talk of war, not just with Iran, but in other places in the world, are talked so freely and so casually by this administration. We need to put the brakes on, and we're going to do our job here in Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. We now have Senator Merkley and Representative Connolly, both extraordinary leaders. Let me just in the order they came. Senator Merkley has been a terrific and consistent voice for restraint in foreign policy and preventing us from going from Iran. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we knew we were in trouble when the president chose Pompeo and Bolton as his top national security advisors. John Bolton, who probably played an influential role in the worst foreign policy decision of the last century, and who is famous for his bomb Iran commentary. And Pompeo, who said, we don't need the JCPOA. If they misbehave, we just bomb them. So that's the pair. And what have they done? They have sent over the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Force. They have proceeded to pre-deploy B-52 bombers. They have labeled a section of the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. And they have violated the very core of the deal with Iran by turning the screws economically so that the country of Iran is desperate for currency from its oil. All of this to set the stage for the conflict. All we are doing here today is to stand up and say, we stand with the Constitution. We stand with the vision laid out by our founders, who said the issue of war and peace is too big a deal to be decided by any one person, and that includes the president. General Washington, who became President Washington, absolutely emphasized this. He was the one person who might have been able to say, doesn't matter what the Constitution says, we need to have this power of war and peace vested in me as the first president of the United States. But he didn't. He said the Constitution is clear, and he explained why. Jefferson did the same, and when Jefferson was in office, he said we've got to go to Congress to make decisions of war and peace. So now we have an administration that has been laying out the argument that, well, maybe Congress did already authorize with the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, because that was about Al-Qaeda, and Iran talks to Al-Qaeda occasionally. Maybe we can use that as a justification. And this amendment in the Defense Authorization Act says no, absolutely not. Congress has not authorized war in any shape or form. You want to go to war, you come to Congress. That's the Constitution, and it's on a foundation of very rational thinking about very serious issues. So we know what happens when leaders and air-conditioned officers go to war in the Middle East. It's not pretty, and it has enormous consequences in blood and in treasure and in the reverberations that will extend for generations afterwards. We want that debate, as envisioned in the Constitution, to happen in the House and the Senate. Now, both have voted. The majority in the Senate were for the amendment. The majority in the House for the amendment. So we're saying today, let the conference committee listen to the House and Senate. It's absolutely essential that this amendment be in the version of the Defense Authorization Act that goes to the President of the United States. I'm here to be pleased with all of you in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Merkley, for your leadership. Before I introduce Representative Connolly, one of my favorite members, I just want to say a few words because they've called votes about some of our grassroots leaders. Most importantly, Stephen Miles with Win Without War. Let me tell you his passion. It was 2 in the morning with the NDAA debate, and I was getting updates from him more than my own staff. He was looking at every single amendment that passed, and I can't say enough how much Win Without War, people like Medea Benjamin with her group of Code Pink, with J Street, how much the grassroots activists around this country have been responsible for changing the conversation from when we went to war in Iraq to now stopping our war in Iran. I've gotten to know Representative Connolly because I'm on the oversight committee with him. And let me tell you, if you haven't heard him question a witness, it is worth doing and just watching. He is one of the most brilliant people in questioning and putting forth his values, and he's been a consistent voice against getting into more foolish, endless wars. Representative Connolly.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rowan. Thank you for your leadership in restoring some sense of sanity to foreign policy on the floor of the House last week, and I really appreciate it. A few points. You know, the Trump foreign policy is all about making America retreat again. And there were 3 really destabilizing decisions he's made that contribute to that. Walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade deal led under the United States that now has created a vacuum the Chinese can walk into. Walking away from the Paris Climate Accord, so that we're the only nation in the world not participating in the goal setting in that accord and not recognizing, obviously, the threat of climate change. But the third, and maybe the most consequential immediately, is ripping up the Iran nuclear agreement, known as the JCPOA. It is the first nuclear agreement of its kind, and it was working in all respects. Consistently, the IAEA out of Vienna confirmed the Iranians were complying. Our own government, even the first year of the Trump administration, confirmed the same. And yet, because of pique, because he couldn't stand the fact that it was an accomplishment of his predecessor, this president has put the security of the region at risk and has set in motion the very thing we were seeking to avoid, a nuclear Iran. It was reckless, irresponsible, destabilizing. And now, horrors of horror, when the Iranians react, his hawks are beating the war drums. We don't need another war. We don't need another war. Negotiations produced a treaty that was working and reaching its goals. We need to return to that. It's not like we don't have solutions readily at hand. And that's why making sure that this resolution becomes law, if we can, sets the stage for being able to do that. The world demands no less, and peace demands action now. Thank you.
We have a few more speakers from the organizations represented behind me. I promise we're all going to be brief because we know it's a bit warm out here. And first up, I'd like to invite Ryan Costello from the National Iranian American Council. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Steve. Well, thanks to all the speakers who helped make this vote possible. It's really incredible to be here from where we were a month ago and know that we are potentially poised to pass in the final defense authorization something that would prevent an unauthorized war with Iran. You know, working with the Iranian American community, you know, I've been privileged to mobilize with them against the disastrous war of choice with Iran. And one thing that I've learned is that this community knows the cost of war. Many of them survived the Iran-Iraq war that was 8 years long. Many of them heard from friends and family about the disastrous consequences of that war. And then many of them saw with the 2003 invasion of Iraq that was premised on lies that had just brought chaos and suffering instead of peace and prosperity. So the Iranian American community, it knows the cost of war, but Donald Trump does not. Donald Trump tore up his predecessor's nuclear deal, which peacefully constrained Iran's nuclear program without a single shot fired. Donald Trump hired John Bolton as his national security advisor, who would rather bomb Iran than negotiate with it. Donald Trump routinely threatens Iran over Twitter, in all caps no less, with consequences the likes of which few throughout history has ever suffered before. And thanks to his own actions, Donald Trump precipitated a crisis with Iran that brought us 10 minutes from the brink of war. The Iranian American community and millions of Americans are thankful for his last-second change of heart, but we can't rely on Trump for continued restraint. That's why I'm so grateful that Congress is listening to the American people and taking action by passing the Khanna Gates Amendment. We're signaling that it will not sit idly by while a man who doesn't know the price of war drags us into a new war of choice. Thank you so much.
Next up, we'll have Diana Olbaum, the Legislative Director for the Friends Committee on National Legislation.
Thanks so much, Steve. If there's one thing that our nation should have learned over the last 18 years, it is that war is not the answer. Our ever-expanding and endless wars around the globe demonstrate that there are no military solutions to the challenges that face us. We cannot make ourselves more secure by making others less secure. Do not be fooled by talk of a so-called limited strike. Any war with Iran would be devastating, and the greatest toll would fall upon the poorest and most vulnerable populations. We must all work persistently to prevent this possibility. That's why over the last few months, we at the Friends Committee on National Legislation have been mobilizing thousands of Quakers and other activists to stand up and tell Congress they don't want another senseless war in the Middle East. We joined with hundreds of faith leaders in calling on our elected officials to seek real diplomatic and humanitarian solutions to the current crisis and refrain from military confrontation with Iran. On Friday, Congress listened. We applaud the distinguished members of Congress, senators and representatives who spoke here this afternoon, and led and sponsored a bipartisan amendment to the National Defense Authorization Bill that passed the House by a whopping vote of 251 to 170. The Khanna Gates Amendment would prohibit an unauthorized war with Iran and take our countries off the fast track to violent confrontation. The Khanna Gates Amendment is very simple. It reasserts the requirements of the Constitution that Congress has the power of the purse. Congress, not the President, decides if and when our country goes to war. As a matter of conscience, FCNL opposes all war. As a matter of public policy, we believe, as the founders intended, that Congress must debate and vote before introducing U.S. armed forces into hostilities. The Senate now has the opportunity to do the right thing and prevent war before it starts. If they think it's a hard vote now, how much more difficult will it be after a war has started? Will it be easier to cut off funds once we have troops on the battlefield? We will be working with Quakers, other people of faith, and our broader network around the country to urge the conferees on this year's defense policy bill to choose the path of peace by adopting the Khanna Gates language to prevent an unauthorized war with Iran. Thank you.
Next up, we're going to have Ben Schneider. He's the Vice President of Political Affairs at J Street.
Hi, I'm Ben Schneider with J Street, the pro-Israel, pro-peace movement here in Washington and across the country. And I just want to thank Win Without War, our other coalition partners. I want to thank members of the House, members of the Senate who have been leading on this important issue. And I don't want to repeat what's been said, but what I do want to say is that a majority of American Jews, oppose an unnecessary war with Iran. A majority of Americans oppose an unnecessary war with Iran. This is bad policy for the United States. It would be bad policy and in Israel's worst interests. And we intend to make sure that that majority of American Jews and that majority of Americans have a voice in these halls of Congress, and that the conferees and House and Senate leadership hear from us so that we can draw a line in the sand and ensure that we do not have yet another unnecessary and stupid war in the Middle East. So thank you to the members of Congress for their leadership and our coalition partners as well.
Next up, we're going to have Paul Kavika Martin, the Political Director of Peace Action.
Thank you, Stephen. On behalf of Peace Action's 100 chapters and affiliates, we want to thank all the senators and representatives who spoke earlier and their leadership to make sure we do not enter a war with Iran. Because of the Trump administration's policy of maximum provocation towards Iran, our nation stands at the precipice of another war of choice in the Middle East. Thankfully, a majority of Congress, with the backing of the public, have spoken and reiterated what the Constitution already says. States no uncertain terms that the president cannot start a war without congressional support. In these turbulent times, it's worth remembering how the Trump administration's policy created this crisis. President Trump says he wants to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon, but unilaterally he withdrew from the Iran agreement that keeps Iran's nuclear program in check. Thank you for supporting no war with Iran. Congress stepping up to assert its constitutional authority over war is a welcome development, but with this administration's history of going around and sidestepping congressional authority, Congress must do everything in its power to make sure that we have no war of choice in Iran. Thank you very much.
Down to our final two speakers, I promise, almost done. Next up, Director of Government Relations with Vote Vets, Will Goodwin.
Good afternoon. My name is Will Goodwin. I'm Director of Government Relations for Vote Vets, the nation's largest and first progressive veterans organization with more than 600,000 members across all 50 states. We're so grateful for all of the members who spoke today, for their leadership, and to all of our partner organizations here for working together to stand up not only for the Constitution, but for our men and women in uniform and their families. The same men and women in uniform who swore an oath to risk their lives in defense of that Constitution. And the idea that we would send those young men and women who swore that oath to the Constitution into a war that is itself unconstitutional is unacceptable. And it's unacceptable to America's veterans and our allies across the political spectrum who have been organizing and now working together to demand that this amendment remain in the final version of the NDAA. It's why Vote Vets and Concerned Veterans for America have joined forces for the very first time to mobilize our members, liberal, conservative, and everyone in between, in support of the work that these leaders are doing today. We've done the polling and found that a majority of Americans oppose the prospect of the U.S. conducting an attack on Iran, and only 3 in 10 Americans believe that we should still be relying on the 2001 AUMF for future military action at all. The members working across party lines to ensure this amendment stays in the final NDAA are showing courage and leadership, and in doing so, honoring all of us who have ever worn the cloth of this nation, past, present, and future. We urge all members to continue working with the great groups represented here today to see this bipartisan effort across the finish line. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we have Andrew Albertson, the Executive Director of Foreign Policy for America.
Okay, thanks, everybody. I think I'm what's standing between us and air conditioning, so I will try to go quickly. But there's a few things I wanted to say. So again, I'm Andrew Albertson. I'm the Executive Director of Foreign Policy for America. We're a national membership-based organization that's fighting for principled American engagement in the world. And we also help elect great candidates for Congress that champion strong principled American foreign policy. Most important thing I just wanted to say is that we're so proud to play a role and a part of this effort, this bipartisan effort and to stand alongside leaders in the Senate like Senator Udall and Senator Merkley, Senator Murphy, in the House, Congressman Khanna, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Congressman Levin, and so many others. I also just want to take the opportunity to thank again the partner organizations that we collaborated with on this. So Win Without War, J Street, the National Iranian American Council, the Friends FCNL, Friends Committee on National Leadership, Peace Action West. We're honored every time we get to stand alongside these extraordinary organizations with their grassroots membership and stand strong for our values. This is a time when I think we all know just how much is at risk, and the debate over war with Iran brings that home. There's no more consequential decision that the U.S. government can make than to go to war, to disrupt the lives of military families around the country, to divert investments that might have otherwise gone to infrastructure at home, education, healthcare here in the U.S. And our founders had the wisdom to vest that decision-making authority not in one single person, but in Congress. And so we are thrilled to see Congress reassert its constitutional authority, to see members of Congress from the right and the left, from all different parts of the country, stand strong to say it is Congress' role and unique role to declare war, to make that incredibly weighty decision. And so we're thrilled to see the actions of majority of senators in voting on this bill for its passage in the House. And now we call upon the conferees to follow the will of the American people, to act on this momentum that's been created, and to make clear that Congress has not and will not and is not authorizing war with Iran, and to have the necessary oversight on this incredibly important matter of national security, to have the oversight of this White House. So honored again to be with all these partner organizations, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share with all of you today.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today. I'd also like to thank our partners at Move On, who are not here with us in person, but who are live streaming this to their members and activists around the country. And I'd just like to end by saying thank you all very much.